Today on BenchBriefs, we're looking at a landmark case from the Supreme Court of Canada that tackles the delicate balance between government transparency and the need to keep certain information confidential. In BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association versus British Columbia, the court examined whether the provincial government could withhold records about a proposed liquefied natural gas project and what that means for access to information laws across Canada. At its core, this case is about how much the public has a right to know about government decisions and where the line should be drawn to protect sensitive government discussions. The BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association, a group advocating for open government, requested access to records held by the British Columbia government. Specifically, they wanted communications and documents related to the government's decision-making process around an LNG project, a major economic and environmental issue in the province. The government refused to disclose these records, citing exemptions under the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, or FIPPA. These exemptions included protections for cabinet confidences and policy advice. Essentially, the government argued that certain records needed to stay secret to preserve the confidentiality of internal discussions and advice given to cabinet ministers. This raised a big question. When can the government legitimately withhold information? And when does that withholding go too far, undermining the public's right to transparency? The Supreme Court was asked to decide three main issues. First, did the government properly apply the exemptions under a FIPPA to withhold these records? In other words, were these documents truly protected as cabinet confidences or policy advice, or were they something the public should have access to? Second, did the provisions in FIPPA that allow the government to withhold certain records violate constitutional principles, such as the separation of powers and the rule of law? And third, how should the public's right to access government information be balanced against the need to protect confidential government deliberations and decision-making processes? To understand the significance of the case, it helps to know a bit about the exemptions at play. The Cabinet Confidences exemption is designed to protect the secrecy of discussions and decisions made within the executive branch, so ministers can debate and advise each other freely without fear that their conversations will be publicly exposed. The policy advice exemption similarly protects advice given to decision makers, allowing for candid recommendations without public scrutiny at every step. These protections are important because they support effective government decision-making and preserve the separation between the branches of government. On the other hand, access to information laws like FIPPA promote transparency, accountability, and public trust by ensuring citizens can see how decisions that affect them are made. Striking the right balance between openness and confidentiality is tricky, especially when it involves politically sensitive or commercially important projects like LNG development. In its decision, the Supreme Court upheld the government's use of these exemptions, confirming that the withheld records did indeed fall within the scope of cabinet confidences and policy advice protections. The court emphasized that these exemptions are critical to maintaining the confidentiality needed for robust, uninhibited discussions within the executive branch. At the same time, the court recognized that this confidentiality must be balanced with the public interest in disclosure, but found that the Act's exemptions and processes struck an appropriate balance. Importantly, the court also addressed the constitutional questions. It confirmed that FIPPA's provisions do not infringe on the separation of powers or the rule of law. The Act respects the roles of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and the exemptions serve a valid purpose in protecting the executive's ability to function effectively. This means that legislatures can enact laws that limit access to certain government information, provided those limits are reasonable and serve important constitutional objectives. Why does this case matter? because it clarifies the limits of access to information in Canada and reinforces the principle that some government information must remain confidential to protect effective governance. It sets a precedent for how courts should approach claims of exemption under freedom of information laws, especially regarding cabinet confidences and policy advice. For citizens, it underscores that while transparency is fundamental, it doesn't mean every piece of government communication will be publicly available. For governments, it affirms that they can safeguard sensitive deliberations without running afoul of constitutional principles. This case also highlights the ongoing tension between open government and confidentiality, a tension that will continue to evolve as public expectations for transparency grow and governments grapple with complex policy decisions. The Supreme Court's decision provides a thoughtful framework for navigating this tension, balancing openness with the practical needs of governance. Thanks for listening to this episode of Bench Briefs. Join us next time as we dive into another important legal decision shaping Canada's justice landscape. Until then, take care.